Hello and welcome, dear students, to this lecture on scope and significance of comparative politics. Now, before we go into the lecture, let's look at the objectives of this topic. Number one, to explore the growing scope of comparative politics as an academic field of study. Number two, to elaborate on the journey of comparative politics from traditional to behavioral to post-behavioral trends. And number three, to examine the significance of comparative politics and try to answer the question as to why should we study it. Let us first come to the scope and significance of comparative politics. Dear students, comparative politics is a vibrant academic subdiscipline of political science with a much broader scope or subject matter. In order to have a comprehensive understanding of the scope of the field of comparative politics, we must first begin with what is compared in this field. The classical cases of comparative politics are national political systems. These are still the most important political units in the contemporary world. However, national systems are not the only cases that comparative politics analyzes. Firstly, non-national political systems are also comparable. For example, subnational regional political systems like state level in the US or the German Länder, or supranational units such as regions, say Western Europe, Central Eastern Europe, North America, Latin America, and so on, or the empires, Ottoman Empire, Russian, Chinese, Roman, etc., as well as the supranational organizations like European Union, the North American Free Trade Agreement, etc. Secondly, types of political systems can be compared. For example, a comparison can be made between democratic and authoritarian regimes in terms of like freedoms available to the citizens or economic performance. Thirdly, comparative politics also compares single elements of the political system rather than the whole system. Researchers compare the structure of parliaments of different countries or cabinets or the policies, for example, welfare state or the environmental policies of different countries, or the finances of parties or trade unions, and the absence or presence of direct democratic institutions and electoral laws, and so on. In principle, the discipline of comparative politics covers all aspects of the political system. It has been argued that precisely because comparative politics encompasses everything from a substantial point of view, it has no substantial specificity, rather only a methodological one resting on comparison. However, the fact remains that there is a substantial specificity which resides in the empirical analysis of internal structures, actors, and processes. It is also true that comparative politics has been through different phases in which its focus on particular aspects has shifted. By looking at these focal points, we can know a lot about the scope of the discipline. Comparative politics before the Second World War was mainly concerned with the analysis of the state and its institutions. Institutions were defined in a narrow sense, overlapping with the state power, like the executive, legislature, and judiciary, the civil administration, and the military bureaucracy. Old institutionalism was formal, using constitutional texts and legal documents as the main data. This tradition can be traced back to the constitutional authors such as Jean Bodin, Montesquieu, etc. The emphasis of the study of formal political institutions focused naturally on the geographical areas where they first developed, that is, the Western Europe and North America. While the study of state institutions remains important, the reaction against what was perceived as legalistic study of politics led to one of the major turns in the discipline between the 1930s and the 1960s, a period considered by many as the golden age of comparative politics. The behavioral revolution imported from anthropology and biology as well as sociology shifted the substance of comparative politics away from the institutions. This tradition can be traced back to the macro sociology of Spencer, Auguste Comte, Marx, Tocqueville, and Weber, and led to theories of macro-historical sociology, cultural theories, as well as neo-institutionalism, with a much broader conception of norms and their social meaning, and a strong emphasis on history. Pioneers of comparative politics, such as Gabriel Almond, founder of the Committee on Comparative Politics in 1954, started analyzing other aspects of politics than just the formal institutions and observing politics in practice rather than as defined in official texts. What triggered this revolution? This was primarily because more attention was devoted to new cases, that is, a rejection of the focus on West and the developed world alone. Early comparativists like James Bracy, Charles Merriam, Lawrence Lowell, and Woodrow Wilson assumed that the world would converge towards Western models of political order. With this in mind, it made sense to focus on major Western countries alone. However, the rise of communist regimes in the Eastern Europe and later in China and Central America, and the breakdown of democracy where fascist dictatorships came to power and in some cases lasted until 1970s, as in Portugal, Spain, and Latin America, made it clear that other types of political orders could exist and needed to be understood. After the Second World War, patterns of decolonization encouraged analysis beyond Anglo-Saxon style liberal democratic institutions. New patrimonialistic regimes emerged in Africa and the Middle East, and the populist ones in South America. These divergent patterns could not be understood within the narrow categories of Western institutions. New categories and concepts were required, as was greater attention to other actors such as the revolutionary parties and the clans under patrimonialistic leadership. The mobilization of the masses that took place in communist and fascist regimes in Europe as well as under populism in South America turned attention away from institutions and directed it towards ideologies, belief systems, and communication. This motivated comparativists to ask which were the favorable conditions for democratic stability, and thus to look into the political cultures, social capital, and the traditions of authority. Finally, the closer analysis of Europe also contributed to a shift away from the formal analysis of institutions. From 1960s onwards, European comparative political scientists started to question the supposed supremacy in terms of stability and efficiency of Anglo-Saxon democracies based on majoritarian institutions and homogeneous cultures. Other types of democracies were not necessarily the unstable democracies like France, Germany, or Italy. Therefore, the scope of comparative politics widened as new and new cases of investigation were brought to the forefront that had hitherto remained unaddressed. So, dear students, what have been the consequences of the broadening of the geographical and historical scope of the subject matter? First, it increased the variety of political systems. Secondly, it pointed to the role of agencies other than institutions, in particular the political parties, interest groups, civil society organizations, social movements, and media. Thirdly, it introduced a new methodology based on empirical observations, large-scale comparisons, statistical techniques, and an extraordinary effort of quantitative data collection. Fourth, a new language, namely systemic functionalism, was imported in comparative politics. The challenge presented by the extension of the scope of comparison was to elaborate the conceptual body in order to be able to encompass the diversity of the cases. So, concepts, indicators, and measurements that had been developed for a set of Western cases did not fit to the new cases. It also soon became clear that Western concepts had a different meaning in other parts of the world. Therefore, the emphasis on the institutions and the state was dropped because of the need for more general and universal concepts. Concepts were redefined to cover non-Western settings, the pre-modern societies, and non-state polities. Most of these categories were taken from very abstract depiction of the social system by Talcott Parsons. Functions dealing with the survival of the systems were perceived as particularly important. From biology and cybernetics, David Easton and Carl Deutsch imported the ideas of systemological systems, body systems, and so on, and identified survival as its most important function. Similarly, in the 1950s, the most important topic was to understand why some democracies survived while others collapsed. Gabriel Almond and Sidney Verba's The Civic Culture, published in 1963, is considered as a milestone precisely because it identified specific cultural conditions favorable or unfavorable for democratic stability. Soon, it also became clear, however, that the price to be paid for encompassing transcultural concepts was that of an excessive level of abstraction. This framework was not informative enough and too remote with regard to the concrete historical context of the specific systems. In the 1970s, European comparative political scientists like Steinrocken and others, and even more so, the area specialists from Eastern Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia had already noted that the historical categories of systemic functionalism did not allow the understanding of concrete cases. The counter-reaction to systemic functionalism starts precisely in 1967 and involves, number one, a shift of substantial focus, 2, a narrowing of the geographical scope, 3, a change of methodology, and 4th, a theoretical turn. The shift of substantial focus consists of a return to the state and its institutions. In recent decades, there has been a re-establishment of the centrality of the institutions, more broadly defined as sets of rules, procedures, and social norms. In the new institutionalism theory, institutions are seen the most important actors with autonomy and being part of the real politics. Institutions, furthermore, are seen as determining the opportunity structures and limits within which individuals formulate preferences. The cyclical process of broadening the scope of comparative politics into traditional, behavioral, and post-behavioral phases, as characterized by Ronald Chilcott, can be summarized as having 6 broad characteristics. 1. The post-1960s phase of comparative politics has been marked by a growing awareness among scholars that there was a price of excessive level of abstraction being paid for encompassing transcultural concepts. It was argued that this framework was not informative enough and was too remote with regard to the concrete historical context of specific systems. Therefore, the trend was to bring back state and its institutions within the study of comparative politics. Secondly, however, the great contribution made by the systemic paradigm has not been lost. We continue to speak of political system and use this tool to organize the various dimensions of domestic politics. In fact, the structure of many of the textbooks of comparative politics mirrors the political system as described by David Easton. Easton's work is a monumental theoretical contribution from the systemic paradigm, still unraveled and probably the last and the most important attempt to build a general empirical theory including all actors and processes of political system. Thirdly, Easton's concepts have marked the minds of political scientists as well as those of the wider public. His attempt has been an extremely systematic one, with subsequent and cumulative contributions drafted towards one single goal. His concept of political system is wider and encompasses almost every aspect of the study of comparative politics. It includes institutions and agencies as well as public policies. It also covers political communication, culture, socialization and behavior, as well as interest articulation through political parties, movements and pressure groups. Fourthly, the substantive scope has not ceased to grow, and this trend has continued over the most recent decades. There has been a change in the focus from input processes to output processes, namely public policies and policy making, as well as the outcome and impact of policies. In particular, recent trends of what is compared include industrial relations, trade, and economic policies. Fifthly, new trends also include awareness of interdependence between national systems. Today, most countries are open systems subject to external influences, borrowing and learning from the practices of others, and are part of multi-level governance arrangements. And finally, dear students, in spite of the resurgence of institutions in a narrow sense, other theories maintain their influence, and through more attention to psychological, indeed behavioral factors boosted by experimental methods at an individual level, challenge the assumption of rationality of actors. New institutionalism includes normative, historical, and rational choice varieties. Macro-historical sociology has changed into comparative political economy at both macro, say the classes, and micro, the individual levels. Cultural theories maintain their relevance in the study of identities, trust, authoritarian versus liberal attitudes, etc. Thus, while exploring the trajectory of the widening scope of comparative politics, it can be argued that the field has traveled a lot from being a traditional and narrow-focused field of inquiry into a more broad, vibrant, and promising field of study. Now, dear students, let's have a look at why to study comparative politics. Now, to answer this question, which essentially involves the significance of the discipline of comparative politics, we must ask whether this subject is relevant at all. The issue of relevance of political science in general and then the subdiscipline of comparative politics has recently received increased attention both in the public debate and within the discipline itself. To answer a question like, is comparative politics relevant? It's important that a more basic issue is resolved first, namely, for whom, what or when should this knowledge be relevant? Many different answers could be given to this question. Firstly, Comparative politics could be relevant for informing the elite, giving advice to parties on how to win elections or how to campaign, or how politicians should best act so as to get enough support for their policies in legislative assemblies, how they should interact with strong interest groups such as business organizations and labor unions, as well as how to best handle factions within their party. So, as far the issue of relevance is concerned, comparative political scientists can act as consultants, advisors, or even so-called grey eminences to politicians. This is also where many of those with a degree in political science end up, for example, as ministerial advisors or policy consultants, professions which have increased considerably in almost all organizations of economic cooperation and development, OECD countries. Plato ventured into this area some 2,300 years ago with his 3 famous journeys to Sicily, where he was asked to educate the new king of Syracuse in the noble art of governing. The historical record shows that Plato came to deeply regret his role as a teacher to the king. His advice fell on the deaf ears and the king became a ruthless tyrant, ruining his country. A second idea for making comparative political science more relevant is based on informing not the political elite but the general public. This is the comparative political scientist as the public intellectual, writing op-ed articles, giving public lectures, and commenting upon current affairs in the media. The number of political events that deserve comments are in principle endless. Why does a country X have higher economic growth? Why is gender equality better in some countries than others? Why does nation Z have such a huge welfare state? Here, the level of relevance would be determined by the question, can political scientists offer something more, deeper, and qualitatively different than what we get from an astute political journalist or a pundit that is also intelligible for the general public? One argument for this approach is that everything else being equal, it cannot be a disadvantage to the quality of debate about public policies in a democracy if people with more knowledge choose to participate. For long, it was taken for granted that the well-being of the population in a country rested on non-political factors such as natural resources, technology, and medical intervention, the structure of social classes, cultural norms, including religion, etc. The political institutions were seen merely as a superficial reflection or as a superstructure of the underlying structural forces and thus had no or very little impact on the overall prosperity or well-being of a country. This changed in economics, sociology, and political science during the 1990s with what has been termed as the institutional turn. The economic historian and the Nobel laureate Douglas C. North was among us the first to point to the importance of institutions, understood as the rules of game, for explaining why some countries were much more prosperous than others. This became known as the new institutionalism, and in comparative politics as historical institutionalism. Comparing societies with almost identical structural conditions revealed that they could be dramatically different in their ability to produce human well-being, and the scholars in the various institutional approaches could empirically show that what explained the differences was the variation in political, legal, and administrative institutions. The implication of this institutional turn for the relevance of comparative politics can hardly be overstated. An example is the issue of access of safe water. The magnitude of the problem can be illustrated by the reports from the World Health Organization, which constantly argue that billions of people lack access to safe water or adequate sanitation. This is more so in the developing countries, where millions of children die every year due to the contaminated water. Now, what makes this enormous problem relevant from a comparative politics perspective is that a growing number of experts in the area argue that the problem is not, as was previously assumed, an issue of the lack of technical solution. The acute lack of clear water that affects such a large number of people in the developing countries is not due to the lack of technical solutions such as pumps, reservoirs, or saviors, nor is the problem caused by the limited access to the natural clean water. Instead, the main problem seems to lie within the judicial and administrative institutions, or in other words, in the dysfunctional state apparatus. Developing countries, more often than not, possess the technical devices needed to provide the population with clean water, but the problem is that these technical installations rarely fulfill their functions due to the lack of supervision, incompetence, and the corruption in public sector. So, in many cases, corruption in the procurement of processes result in extremely low quality infrastructure being put in place. The implication is that for comparative politics to be policy relevant, it is not necessary to side with a specific political ideology or specific interest group. The capability approach to the social justice is of course a normative theory, but based on the generally held idea that most people would prefer to live in a country where people get basic facilities of life and are reasonably satisfied with their lives. More than anything else, an abundance of empirical research shows that the ability to become a successful society in this sense is decided by the quality of society's political institutions, including the administrative and legal institutions which are inherently political. Simply put, some societies are more successful than others in achieving broad-based human well-being for their population, and empirically, for the most part, this turns out to be caused by the quality of government. The implication is that the question of whether comparative political science can be relevant becomes different from the consultant or advisor and the public intellectual approaches that we have discussed already. Instead, it becomes a question of the extent to which the discipline can contribute to the increased human well-being by specifying which political institutions are most likely to increase human well-being and how such institutions can come about. For all these reasons, it is the field of academic discipline of comparative politics which becomes not only significant but also highly relevant. So, dear students, in conclusion, we can say that comparative politics is not limited to the comparison of national political systems, but also includes other units such as subnational and supranational organizations, single political actors, processes, and policies. With the widening of the number of cases, the need for more general concepts that could travel beyond Western countries led to a focus on functions rather than institutions. In the past 3 decades or so, however, a reaction against overly abstract analysis has led back to mid-range theories limited in space and time. As for the behavioral revolution, rational choice also aims at a general and unified theory of politics applicable in all times and place. This paradigm was imported into political science from economics and stresses the role of institutions in comparative politics. Comparative politics includes as a subject matter all features of political systems and recently has turned its attention towards interaction between them, approaching international relations. The institutional turn in the social science implies a shift away from a focus on structural variables, for example, why some societies are more successful than others in providing human well-being. This implies an increased relevance for comparative politics since the creation, design, and operations of political institutions are among the central objects of study. Institutions, broadly understood as the rules of game, can be both formal and informal. Moreover, they can be located at the input side or at the output side of the political system. This variation opens up an interesting analysis of which institutions are most important for increasing human well-being, which automatically makes the field of comparative politics very significant as well as relevant. With these words, I take your leave. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thank you so much.